I was actually shocked that CBS reported this. It's an article from 2020, and it's called How Jewish American Pedophiles Hide from Justice in Israel. I wonder if they got pushback from that, because you can just imagine how people would, accuse CBS of being anti-Semitic for this, et cetera, given that they do this over like things that have nothing to do with Jews and are just about Zionism.
Sure.
It talks about how Israel's acted as a safe haven for Jewish pedophiles and rapists around the world. And obviously, just to be clear, non-Jews are also rapists and pedophiles, in case there are any anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists out there. It acts as a safe haven for Jewish pedophiles and rapists around the world, from the U.S. to Australia. You mentioned above Brett Ratner, and you report on how he, after being accused of rape and sexual misconduct by 10 women, fled to Israel for protection from prosecution, where you report he may be plotting a comeback to America under Trump. So what are the connections that you found between Epstein and Israel? And do you feel that Israel, and why has Israel acted, if you agree, why has Israel acted as a safe harbor for these serial rapists and abusers?
Well, so in the case of people like Ratner and people like Epstein, they're accused of major sex crimes, but they also have major connections to, organized crime and or intelligence, right? So I think, in their cases, part of it is motivated by, those other connections behind the scenes. Because if you consider, the early history of Israel, for example, some of these organized crime-linked oligarchs we've discussed, the Bronfman family, for example, instrumental in arming the Haganah, the precursor to the IDF, for example. A lot of these, mob figures collaborated with Mossad, including Lansky himself. In the 60s and 70s, Lansky and his illicit empire, intimately connected to not just early financial sources and resources for organized crime, like Tibor Rosenbaum. Rosenbaum was also a major funder of Mossad, right? Of early Mossad. And so a lot of these same figures, over time, I would really argue it's a transnational thing, but they have a lot of ties to Israeli intelligence and also to U.S. intelligence. You have figures like that I talk about in my book, for example, like Bruce Rappaport, who's sort of like this international banker based in Switzerland. But he also had a lot of ties to, Israeli intelligence activity, organized crime, was best friends with Bill Casey when he was CIA director and of course before. And that's how you sort of end up finding more often than not that in a lot of the CIA's most controversial activities, they're collaborating with, Israeli intelligence. And arguably that's because they have connections that go even beyond those agencies, because a lot of times when people talk about intelligence-related crimes or covert operations, people forget that intelligence agencies aren't necessarily the power there. They work for somebody else. So oftentimes, and as I note in my book, for example, in the case of the CIA, the CIA and its precursor, the OSS, were dominated by Wall Street bankers, and those bankers teamed up with organized crime. It was a mutually beneficial relationship, and the CIA ended up taking over a lot of rackets from the mob, like drug trafficking, because, the mob then, by teaming up with the CIA, gets state protection. A lot of, people that were used in assassination efforts backed by the CIA hired mobsters from the U.S. to do that, and there's a lot of cross-pollination between them, and you arguably, follow it long enough, you can't really tell where one ends and one begins. But, most of the CIA's regime change coups were done on behalf of U.S. multinational corporations and because of, oligarch moneyed interests in the U.S. And it makes sense when you consider that most of them originally, were Wall Street bankers or from, elite families and had interests in these multinational corporations and all of that. So, it's important, and this is, something I tried to show in my book, is that there's structures behind these intelligence agencies. And when you look at those, a lot of these operations and activities over the years kind of start to make a lot more sense. So I think in the case of Israel, too, you have a lot of those elements being there, but they existed before Israel was a state. Israel was created in 1948. The mob in the U.S. teamed up with U.S. intelligence before 1948, and a lot of those mobsters, particularly that were part of the Jewish mob, Bugsy Siegel, Lansky, et cetera, were involved in moving weapons to, these paramilitary groups that were later folded into the IDF, including the Haganah. And some of them were big backers also of Menachem Begin and, what proto-Likud, I guess. Which is actually interesting because, Lansky developed, basically the reason he was so successful, at least early on, was because he teamed up with aspects of the Italian Mafia. So before that, organized crime in the U.S. were sort of in these ethnic silos, Italian, Jewish, Irish, blah, 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 et cetera. And so Lansky...
Before they got intersectional?
Yeah, so Lansky and his associate... Charles Lucky Luciano teamed up and sort of broke that silo and became, they basically dominated, right? But basically, they were able to be very successful in doing that and were able to sort of build this transnational empire together. Luciano was deported to Italy around the time that this, their group teamed up with U.S. intelligence, and then was a point man for stuff going on with the CIA in Europe, Operation Gladio, things like that, where basically these false flag attacks were blamed on leftist groups for the purpose of keeping, as many European countries as possible governed by right-leaning governments, and to sort of demonize among the public, more left-leaning political movements, sort of consistent with things that went on in South America, but in a different way, where you have the CIA backing dictatorships extensively throughout the region and during that same period of time. So yeah, the Luciano interests were very affiliated with Mussolini and ethno-fascism. And actually, Likud's antecedents, Menachem Begin and his mentor Zev Jabotinsky, developed revisionist Zionism and was explicitly inspired by Mussolini and said we should apply this to Zionism. And so, a lot of these figures that kind of come downstream of this network, these, Wexner and Bronfman and all of that, are very supportive of that fascist model. And that's a big openly admitted reason for the reason they, teamed up in 1991 and created this group, was to direct their philanthropy to promote that kind of ideology and prevent intermarriage, for example, in their particular communities, and sort of, further that kind of idea. But generally speaking, organized crime is very supportive of ethno-fascism, in fascism in general. And arguably the CIA historically has been as well. So, I think it's important, again, to look at the layer, behind either, these Israel as a government, or the U.S. as a government, or the CIA or Mossad or Israeli intelligence, and realize that there's, been more uniting these different factions and groups that kind of goes on in these other realms. And as far as, since you asked about Epstein and the Israeli state, and I kind of got off on a tangent there. He's really alleged to have been working more closely with Israeli military intelligence, not necessarily Mossad. And this comes from people that, were in Israeli military intelligence that worked with him. Of course, his affiliation with the Maxwell family, who are known to have been Israeli intelligence assets, and not just Robert Maxwell, but also, some of his children. Obviously, Ghislaine is, of course, suspected of that. But her sister, who is a big Silicon Valley figure in both the U.S. and Israel, very close to, former heads of Mossad, Shimon Peres, former prime ministers, a lot of powerful connections, allegedly inherited her father's contacts in that orbit, developed very close ties to Bill Gates in the 1990s, who later, of course, becomes a big Epstein associate, and a lot of other interesting wrinkles there, I guess you could say. And then, of course, there's the case of, Epstein, when he was evading charges. He went to Israel to attempt to evade charges, which is actually, I would call it the Lansky model. It's something Mayor Lansky tried to do, not necessarily for sex charges. In Lansky's case, it was tax evasion, but he didn't want to be prosecuted, so he immigrated to Israel until he was basically assured he wouldn't get in trouble, and then comes back and the charges kind of disappear. And so with Epstein, he, went abroad and didn't come back until his sweetheart deal had been hammered out by people like Alan Dershowitz. But at the time he was, waiting abroad, he was, according to local reports in like Palm Beach, the Palm Beach Post, for example, Epstein was touring military bases in Israel. So that's kind of interesting. If you're just a regular guy charged with a crime in another country and you're going to go visit another country and tour their military bases, doesn't really make a lot of sense unless there was some other, notable connection there. And it's worth pointing to that, Leslie Wexner in particular, through his foundations, has had a lot of ties to Israeli government officials. He has, the Wexner Foundation has whole fellowships dedicated to training people that go into Israeli public service. And also, he's been in negotiations on and off, not recently, but I think back in the 90s and 80s about, setting up ventures in the occupied Golan Heights, for example, in, direct connection with Israel's government and things like that. So there are a lot of interesting overlaps, to say the least. But I don't really necessarily argue that Epstein was exclusively Israeli intelligence. I think he was tied to this network I've been sort of trying to suss out here, that involves, organized crime and intelligence and these oligarch figures, private capital, and was ultimately working on behalf of that group that obviously necessitates ties to all of those elements, right? But ultimately, I think, the network he was working for wasn't exclusive to a particular intelligence agency.